Hello, welcome to the Significant Disproportionality webinar series. This installment of the series is focused on disciplinary equity as part of the PDE Equity Pillars of Practice. Please note, the resources presented in the series are not required as part of the significant disproportionality process. These are simply to offer guidance should an LEA choose to seek out training and/or technical assistance. Again, welcome to a review of the Disciplinary Equity Pillar from the PDE Equitable Practices Hub, which can be found on the Pennsylvania Department of Education homepage. Once you arrive there, you will see that there are 6 pillars of practice: general equity practices, self-awareness, data practices, family and community engagement, academic equity, and disciplinary equity. In subsequent webinars, we have covered all of the other pillars and have arrived at the final pillar, which is disciplinary equity. When you access the Equitable Practices Hub, please note that it is organized into spheres, whether that's school and district, classroom, or individual. Depending upon the role or the team that is determining how to engage on the equity journey, please select the sphere that most aligns to that particular role. The objectives of today's session are to identify the foundational elements of equity in a behavioral tiered framework, ergo, positive behavior interventions and supports, or PBIS. To describe how vulnerable decision points influence disproportionate discipline, and also to describe how positive learning environments address significant disproportionality. Where can you focus? If you are an educator or a related service provider, it would be important to evaluate your current school climate and disciplinary data. Are the practices equitable? Do students have a sense of belonging in your particular school or district? For leaders and administrators, how will you create conditions for staff, students, and communities to see your system as a welcoming space for all? Here's our guiding question for disciplinary equity. Does our system of discipline reflect equity among all student subgroups? So as we consider the term discipline, what we're referring to would be disciplinary decisions or outcomes that speak to suspensions, expulsions, and/or restraints. And also, in thinking about the indicators of significant disproportionality, they are identification, placement, and discipline. Disciplinary equity has an explicit tie to the overarching way to mitigate significantly disproportionate outcomes. So as we think about these questions around disciplinary equity, we have to ask ourselves, are there any one or more subgroups of students who are disciplined at a disproportionate rate versus others for similar offenses? And if so, why does this occur? And those are some of the root cause analysis processes that would be highly important. And if we reflect back on the data practices webinar, there are skills and tips that can help us understand how important that root cause analysis can be. As a reminder, as we heard in the academic equity webinar, the framework that best articulates equitable practices would be a multi-tiered system of support. Equitable practices are for all students. Understanding that equity is not a program or a curriculum that's specific to a specific subgroup. These are systemic approaches that follow a tiered system of support, which focuses on academics, behavior, and social emotional outcomes. Dr. Amber Green from the University of Texas at Arlington has said, equity implementation is MTSS. It is multi-tiered systems of support, because at the core of our equity definition in Pennsylvania, it's giving students what they need at that right moment in their education, whether that's resources, rigor, opportunities, access. The tiered structure allows for that right moment to occur. And so what are some of the foundational elements as it relates to a behavioral tiered system of support? The Center on PBIS has articulated at least 5 foundational elements, one of which is to collect, use, and report disaggregated discipline data. So, this is being able to look at your data system, however, you collect disciplinary data. In a lot of cases, there are schools and districts across the Commonwealth that utilize a system that looks at office discipline referrals, for instance. Others that look at suspensions, others that look at suspensions, expulsions, and or state reportable offenses. Having the ability to look at these data sources and disaggregate by subgroup, whether that's students with disabilities, students of color, students of varying backgrounds, whether that's by lived experience or sexual orientation, gender identity, and or socioeconomic status, being able to know how the system is responding specifically to those groups will be critical. It would also be important, once we have that data, to implement a preventative, multi tiered, culturally responsive behavior framework. Something like positive behavior interventions and supports or restorative practices are things that allow for the ability to prevent a lot of the outcomes that we see happening when it relates to discipline. And so it's important to have an infrastructure that allows for students to get what they need at that right moment. And in PBIS, those tiers are articulated at the universal level, the strategic level, and the intensive level. All the while, we want those tiers to be culturally responsive and appropriate for the students that are in front of us. Using engaging instruction to reduce the opportunity gap. In a previous webinar, there was discussion about how to use engaging instruction to increase equity in education. And as we looked at that, we understood that opportunities to respond was critical. Having feedback that was appropriate and supportive of students and what they know was also important. Having the opportunity to engage with students to build background knowledge was also critical. And finally, the use of explicit instruction. When we have those skills or those strategies at play, the opportunities begin to increase for students to have access to content and access to core curriculum. And we have to understand that at that core, we're not just talking about academics, we're also dialoguing around behavior and social emotional competencies. It's also important to develop policies with accountability for disciplinary equity. Do our policies allow for us to engage in a tiered system of support? Are they focused on equitable practices? Are there some policies that maybe, for instance, are zero tolerance? And if so, why? It's being able to evaluate what fits within our context, the policies that are ensuring that there aren't disproportionate outcomes for certain students. And then lastly, teaching strategies for neutralizing implicit bias in discipline decisions. Every one of us, no matter who we have implicit bias. We have things that impact how we think, things that shape how we react and respond. And so, with that, when we have some of those things at play, what can be some strategies to help us think of different ways of approaching or different ways of having dialogue with students that are different from us? Those are neutralizing strategies or routines. So, we'll talk about those in a moment. So, again, when we think about the tiered structure or the tiered framework for behavior, what we would see through an equity lens, again, comes from the Center on PBIS. So, at tier one, that universal level, we're honoring student strengths through their voice, not just telling them what we're going to do, but actually having that two-way communication where they're informing our practice as well. Our staff is engaging in self awareness. So, understanding those implicit biases that we all have, understanding the different powers that we all have, and how does that impact how we show up in discipline and how we think discipline should be handled. Or things similar to subjective behaviors like respect or disrespect, rather, defiance, disruption. Those are very subjective and can be highly influenced by how we were brought up, the things that we think are expected in school. Those are the ways to engage in self awareness. Also, at Tier 1, we want to use the values and norms of the students, families, and communities that we're serving when we're determining what are appropriate school and also classroom wide expectations. And then, how are we using equitable acknowledgement systems? Often, when we are saying to students, thank you for doing what was expected, or catch you being good, if you will, Are we ensuring that all students have access to those acknowledgments? And if so, why not? And how can we ensure that the students who aren't necessarily always getting those acknowledgments have opportunities to do so? When we move out of the universal space into tier two, more strategic small group, is there access to tier two interventions that are consistent across student groups? So, for instance, if there's an anger management group, are all students able to access that? And again, if so, why not? If not, why? At tier two, can we increase instructional opportunities, whether that's through feedback, and also have positive homeschool communication with students' families? So we're upping the ante, if you will. At that universal level, we're layering on additional supports, and that's tier two. So that increase in intensity. And then at tier three, are the supports that we're now offering individualized and contextualized? So, as I mentioned, at tier two, these are more smaller groups of students that have similar needs or strengths. At tier three, now we want to become a lot more intensive for those specific students with very specific needs. Not only that, are we meaningfully including students and families in the goal setting and intervention design that's being decided for tier three? Is there trust? So, as I said, there's an individualized component at tier three. Does the student trust the provider? Does the provider trust the family? All of that plays a role at that very intensive tier level. Is there two-way communication between family, school, student? All of that, so that it doesn't appear that one entity has full reign over how everything goes, that there's equal voice at tables. And are we limiting, as educators, limiting our assumptions about the home life of our students and their family values? As I've mentioned in a previous webinar with family and community engagement, even if parents aren't or families aren't necessarily showing up to the school, does not mean that they're not engaged. There could be engagement that's happening home based. So it's limiting those assumptions to ensure for the greater good that we're getting the student what they need. So, as we look at the data around disproportionality and behavior, these statistics have not changed greatly. And these are from 2015 and 2013. But what we can see here is that it's important for us to take a look at this data, understand this data, and do something different as a result of this data. And so, when we have data like what we saw, which are showing us that certain groups of students are receiving disproportionate outcomes at rates different than their peers, whether that's students of color, students with disabilities, etc. We have to take a look at that data and understand what are the patterns we're seeing and what can we potentially do as a result of that. So, one thing that's important to note is a distinction between explicit and implicit bias. I mentioned earlier, all of us have implicit bias. It's our cognitive makeup. There are things that kind of sit in our brains and are activated when we see certain things. So, if I say peanut butter, most people will say jelly. Implicitly, we don't even think about it. It's just an association that tends to come naturally. And that's what implicit bias essentially can be. It can be an association that we as individuals are not always aware that we have, and yet our actions don't always line up with our values. And so, not to go too far into that, but what I want us to think about is as we're looking at data, what we can start to pinpoint is that explicit bias, things that are in your face, very clear, would show as a pattern of consistent disproportionality across all situations. So, let's just say we have a group of Latino boys, and in our data set, we're seeing that across settings, meaning in the classroom, in the hallway, in the cafeteria, at the bus, consistently our Latino boys are receiving some type of disciplinary referral, some type of disciplinary outcome, etc. That is a lot, that's explicit. We can pinpoint that it's this particular group that is receiving the most and it's across the board. The implications for that is that we may need to really look at our policy. Does our policy speak to something that may be cultural in nature that is forcing educators to feel that they have to use discipline as a mechanism with those students? Are we regularly reporting data? And is there accountability for us to shift? That's explicit. What often happens in education is where we see implicit bias live. And so in our data, typically the pattern that's noticed are peaks and valleys of disproportionality, very dependent upon the situation. So if we take that same example of Latino boys, and we only see it in classroom A and classroom C, but in the cafeteria, at the bus, in classroom A and D, we don't have the same levels or rates. That can make you wonder what's happening in classroom A and C that is causing, if you will, some of these behaviors to spike. So, the implications for that could be clarifying the disciplinary procedures. Are educators equipped to understand maybe some cultural differences? And if not, why? How can we help them to understand? Or are there just certain behaviors that we need to take a deeper dive around? So, something like disrespect. So, what's considered respectful to one person may not be respectful to another. So, those clarifications of discipline or definitions is really critical so that we can say respect at XY school means this. That way, from classroom to classroom, disrespect as an infraction has a meaning that's similar across the board. That is a strategy around decision making. In addition to that, neutralizing routines, telling that grade level team or that department, we all are in agreement that when this behavior is exhibited, this is our general response. Those are things that can really support when we see implicit bias sort of happening in the data across time. So, what else happens? With implicit bias, this leads to ambiguous judgments, snap decisions, unconscious behaviors. As I said, unconscious, oftentimes, again, associations, peanut butter and jelly. These are things we don't always think about, but they often lead to quick decisions that we haven't had a moment to think through. So, as you think about that, a key question would be where do you see implicit bias impacting decisions to discipline students? This brings me to a concept called vulnerable decision points. And so, as we look at bias, as I said, explicit or implicit, most times implicit for people, and we apply a situation, whether that's a student threw a pencil or a student rolls their eyes, whatever that bias is that we have in our brain, that association that we put there, we add that situation, sometimes and oftentimes we see disproportionate discipline occur. And so you may say, well, what are some of those reasons? The vulnerable decision points are exactly what happens when bias meets a situation and leads to disproportionate discipline. So things like subjectivity of behavior. Kent McIntosh would say the three Ds: disrespect, defiance, and disruption. Highly subjective, vulnerable to bias. A vague discipline system. Again, lack of consistency from one classroom to the next. What's considered poor behavior in one may not be in another. That can also lead to disproportionate discipline. Prior incidents, that association. I've had the opportunity to have a family of students, and now the youngest student arrives in my classroom based on prior experience. I'm like, yep, I'm going to make sure I do X, Y, and Z before I even give that student a chance to show themselves. And so, bias, that association of a prior incident, can impact that situation. Something as simple as our physical state can also impact how we react those snap decisions. So hunger, when coupled with subjectivity or a vague discipline system, can combine to create disproportionate discipline. Fatigue. Most people are fatigued in the afternoon. If we're starting to see a spike in our data, this could be a result of some vulnerable decision points. And then lack of familiarity with students. So if you're a teacher in hallway A and you run into a student from hallway C, you've never interacted, you don't really know much other than the students in hallway C have been behavior problems for the building, and you automatically have a bias that impacts the situation when you interact with that student. That could lead to disproportionate discipline as well. So, what do? We can think about neutralizing routines to reduce the effects of implicit bias, or in this case, vulnerable decision points. So, the setting event: teacher, educator has a lack of positive interactions with the student. They're also tired at the same time. The antecedent, what's happening right before, is the student loudly complains about work, subjective behavior. For me, if I'm tired, this may be a significant disruption. For another teacher, maybe not. Without this interruption happening between antecedent and behavior, what often happens is the behavior, as the educator, would be for me to send the student to the office and write up an office discipline referral or an ODR. The consequence would be the student leaves class and they can escape the social interaction, and I also get an escape too as the adult. What if we could do a self assessment in between to say, is this a vulnerable decision point? And the alternative response would be, see me after class. So instead of getting to that behavior of a write up, we've been able to short circuit that whole process by engaging in some steps. And in this case, what's called a neutralizing routine, neutralizing the situation. So, what makes for a good neutralizing routine? They should be brief, they should be if then, clear, and doable. So, no need for a multi step neutralizing routine, but something that you can easily reflect on, whether it's counting to 10, taking a deep breath or a few deep breaths. Whatever it is that makes you take a pause is really important. And so, here are just a very small sampling of examples here of neutralizing routines. So, you saw in the example previous a delay, see me after class. You pause to think it through. Maybe I can delay the office discipline referral. Maybe I can have a conversation. And then number four is to ask. So state your confidence in the student and then discuss that privately. One thing I've shared in other trainings is that sometimes when people feel embarrassed in front of their peers, they amp up what they're doing so that they don't appear weak or they don't appear to have been taken for granted by an adult, etc. And so private conversations can be really beneficial to ensure that there's a legitimate change in behavior or a legitimate rapport building that can take place. I love this from Susan Barrett. She talks about not only neutralizing routines for educators in general, but especially for administrators who often find themselves in the middle determining who should they listen to, what decisions should they make in the heat of the moment. So I love when she says, when you have to handle problem behavior, stop and tell yourself, don't just do something, stand there. So, you know the old adage, don't just stand there, do something. This is a flip on that. It's saying, take a minute. Be sure you're ready to act in line with your values because you, as the administrator, you have to determine what makes the most sense, follow whatever policies are in place. You have a lot to decide. Get information from both the student and the staff, and then assess that student teacher relationship. And how can you enhance that relationship and make it better? And whenever possible, your agreed upon instructional response, keyword instructional, is to teach the missing skill. So if the student is really struggling, what are the things that you can help support the educator by with the instructional piece? Because discipline means to teach, not to punish. So what can we do to ensure that those skills are being addressed as seamlessly as possible? And then connect the student to school and staff. So one of the things that we've learned about school completion or lack thereof is that when students say they don't like school, oftentimes it's because there's not a sense of belonging or there's not a relationship that they've built. And so connecting that student to something that gives them a piece of the school to feel like they have a place at the school is really, really critical when we think about how we can make our school climates more stable and sustainable. So, in summary, vulnerable decision points are specific decisions that are at risk of implicit bias. When we think about how to reduce that, we need to clarify our procedures around discipline, provide strategies for decision making, and know that when we encourage neutralizing routines, this is an option for an alternative response and might reduce the need for that snap decision in the moment. Data review is important to be able to identify where VDPs may be happening. And then, are the neutralizing routines working? And if they're not, what can we do differently? What new routine can we adopt, whether that's individually, grade level, department level, school level, etc.? So, with all of that being said, how does disciplinary equity support addressing significant disproportionality? Well, a few things to really keep in mind would be the evaluation of disciplinary policies to evaluate their explicit tie to equitable practices. Policy drives practice and people drive policy. So it's really important to know and hear from the people who are impacted the most. So if we're seeing that the policies are creating some of the disproportionate outcomes, what can we do to evaluate those policies with a critical view? We need to identify disciplinary decisions that are vulnerable to subjectivity. Do we need to go back and think about our definition of respect? Think about our definition of disruption. Think about how we evaluate inappropriate language, etc. It's very subjective, some of those things. Ensuring that the tiered system of support is addressing the whole child. So, although we may think about MTSS through an academic view, it's important to know that multi tiered systems of support highlight academics, behavior, social, emotional, and trauma informed domains. And lastly, evaluation of overall school climate is really critical to determine are students and staff feeling a sense of belonging and dignity while in the space that they're occupying. It's highly critical that as we consider equity and what it means to be equitable in practice, that at the root, it's about dignity. It's about preserving dignity and for having a safe space where students can grow and thrive. If there are any questions about this particular webinar or any within the webinar series, please feel free to reach out with any of those questions and or requests for technical assistance to the MTSS Equity team. You may find information about MTSS Equity at our patent website, www.patent.net. Thank you.